Harry Lyons, Professor Emeritus, Yuba College, in the biology department.
Biology.
Huh?
I am the biology. All right, thanks for being here. This is wonderful. These Saturdays are called the Living History presentations, so I'm going to reverse that, and I'm going to give you the history of living, at least the living things in Clear Lake and the related ecosystem. Helping me on the baseline studies is Rick McCann. He's going to help me on bass, and Rick, for a living, tunes piano, so this is the first commercial. Rick's piano tuning operation. About a year ago, Mike Adams asked me to take part in a celebration of a Pete Seeger, and an appreciation for Pete Seeger, who mobilized a part of the effort to clean up the Hudson a bit in the 1970s. And so he wanted me to talk scientifically about Clear Lake and also about the Hudson. So I happened to be going back there to see my sister, and so I got to visit my old haunts along the Hudson River where I grew up. And when I got there, I started to make observations on the Hudson River, and I was flabbergasted by how similar the Hudson was to Clear Lake. And of course, you wouldn't see that because you don't own a microscope. So looking at the Hudson in the vertical and the microscopic, it is very, very similar. The food chains are very, very similar. So I travel back to the East Coast, and I usually travel. I have bizarre carry-on. That sounds like a disease, I know. But in my carry-on luggage, I have a Secchi disc, which measures the clarity of water in any body of water, whether it's Cache Creek, or Clear Lake, or Hudson River, or the Central North Pacific. Oceanographers lower this disc into the water, and the depth at which the disc disappears out of sight is a measure of water clarity. And so I always carry that with me. And then I study plankton, which are small drifting animals and plants in bodies of water. Plants are called phytoplankton, and the animals are called zooplankton if you're a Brit, and then zooplankton if you're an American. And so this is to sample both the plants and the animals that are drifting in the water column. And so my luggage, when it's opened, is always a cause for concern for the TSA. And so last time I traveled back, they looked at all this stuff, and they said, oh, NTW. And so I let that go for a second, and then I walked back to the position of station at the TSA, and I said, what's NTW stand for? And they said, non-terrorist weirdo. So I'll need those later in this talk. But I want to say right away that what I'm interested in presenting are some lessons from the Hudson that we could put to work in Clear Lake, and some lessons from Clear Lake that people have put to work in the Hudson. And that's one of the central themes. Both of these systems, the Hudson River ecosystem and the Clear Lake ecosystem, are highly subsidized. So I assume you're familiar with subsidy from normal economic day-to-day life, okay? I had a subsidy from the federal government to go to graduate school. And very often, lots of people are being subsidized for their health care and a lot of other things. And we see this in nature, too. And it is the case with the Hudson that it is different. First, I'm going to say why these two systems are different. The Hudson is different than Clear Lake because the subsidy for the Hudson comes from the moon, and the subsidy for Clear Lake comes from the sun. And the moon causes the tides, and the tides are what mix the Hudson, thoroughly mix the Hudson, twice daily. And the Hudson is actually an estuary. It's salty up from the Battery, lower end of Manhattan, all the way up to near Newburgh, above West Point. It's salty, and it sloshes back and forth all the way up to the federal dam at Troy, where this other red dot is. And so from here, where I grew up in the Narrows, where the Hudson enters the Atlantic Ocean, to all the way up near Albany, past Albany, the Hudson travels 300 miles, but fully 150 miles of it, or half of the Hudson, is tidal, and we can call it an estuary. So the Hudson really isn't a river. For over half its length, it's not a river. And that makes me happy because Clear Lake isn't clear, but god damn it, it's a lake. We're as advertised, right? Okay. So the thing that is remarkably similar about these two systems are numbers. The first number is the average depth. The average depth of the Hudson is slightly over 7 meters. Okay? And the average depth of Clear Lake is slightly under 7 meters. So right away I know they're very similar in their biology because whatever mixing is available can on occasion reach the bottom and bring up nutrients that would be lost from a deeper system. Okay? So if you had a nice deep system like Lake Tahoe, the Central Pacific Ocean, the nutrients that sink out of that system from gravity are lost forever. But for Clear Lake and the Hudson, the nutrients that sink out of the lit zone above water are lost almost never. And that's why these systems are green. That's why I'm talking about lessons from green water. Yes?
How far do you have to go before you stop losing it?
Before you stop losing what?
Losing the mixing.
Oh, losing the mixing 20 meters, 15, 20 meters. Yeah. You start, the wind can't get down there. There's still some tidal mixing, but I'm going to show you there's some separation that limits even that kind of mixing. We'll see that. So, so one's sun mixed, the other's moon mixed, and twice daily the water sloshes in and out of the Hudson. So as a kid, the water would go up 6 miles, down 9 miles, up 6 miles, down 9 miles, and twice daily. And the whatever was of interest to us, if we didn't want to get wet at that moment, we could wait. 12 hours later, it would come back down, and we could get whatever it was, mostly lumber, furniture. And I once asked my grandfather, "Do you ever see bodies?" And his response was, "The Jersey side." But I've never seen anything like that. So the red dots that we see, this is a Superfund site, Environmental Protection Agency Superfund site at the Fort Edward plant of General Electric. This dot here is the Superfund site at the Sulphur Bank mine, and that's our EPA Superfund site. This has to do with pollinated PCBs, pollinated by phenols, by phenyl chlorides, thank you. And our Superfund site has to do with methyl mercury, and I'm going to show you the chemical formulas for these because some of you had chemistry and I want to witness your chemistry flashback, your reaction to that, okay? So, so those are the Superfund sites. Down here in my old stomping grounds near the Narrows, there are several Army Corps of Engineers projects to enhance and introduce wetlands, to improve the filtration system and the nutrient input to this Hudson River system. Right here is a proposed Army Corps of Engineer project, the Middle Creek Restoration Project. And that's something that I'll also have an advertisement for. There's absolutely very little disagreement that this would help the lake in its balance of nutrients. The Middle Creek Marsh is something that I'm gung-ho on and that I'll talk more about. This is Buckingham. Right here, Buckingham is important for 2 reasons. And the first reason is it acts as a block to the wind to some degree, so that the fetch, the distance over which the wind blows, is interrupted. Otherwise, we would have even more mixing and even more nutrient input. So instead of green, the lake would become sun of green. And so that's important for that reason. The second reason is in Buckingham, that's where the people with some money live. Okay? And one of the lessons from the Hudson is that the well-heeled individuals take an interest in the ecosystem, they can be very powerful. There's push from people like me and you, shallow pocket schmoes, and then there's pull from from the wealthy. And it became very important in the Hudson River in the 70s and 80s that that pool was available from the Harrimans, from the Stillmans, from the Osbornes. These are the East Coast robber barons.
How about the Rockefellers?
And the Rockefellers. Clear Lake, we don't have the robber barons. It's too bad. And this is something that we cannot take advantage of. The Stanfords don't live here. The Hopkins don't live here. If they did, I would be talking to them right away. Right. So that's what's happening along here in the Hudson River valleys where all that money is. This is where I spent the summers, just south of West Point, and learned about fishing and learned about estuarine ecology to some extent. And this is where I live now in Jago Bay. If you wanted to surf Clear Lake, if you wanted a bumper sticker that said I surf Clear Lake, you would go to Jago Bay because it is a leeward shore, and we get some pretty good 2-foot waves. Imagine a leprechaun that could surf there. So that's the setup, and this is why I think of these as distinctly different yet very similar. I mentioned the 7-meter depth and the secchi distance, and so you have that in mind. And the other thing is the color of the water. Okay, so this is the most important illustration in this whole talk. Okay, silly, but here it is. These different colors. Okay, it's important to understand the color of the water as an oceanographer or as a person who studies lakes. People who study lakes are called limnologists, because a limb in Latin means lake. And so the colors of waters are interesting. When I was growing up in Bay Ridge, right here in Brooklyn, near the Narrows, they were building this huge bridge. You and I call it the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, okay? But the people in my neighborhood refer to it as the Very Zary Narrows. It's the Very Zary Narrows. And I got to watch that being built, and all my friends were fascinated by that bridge, but I was okay looking at the bridge. What fascinated me was the color of the water, how it changed with seasons and how it changed with sun angle and wind and so on and so forth. I'm still fascinated by that. So here we go. This is the color of the Hudson almost every season. Brown-green because of the organisms, abundant plants, floating plants in the water, and because of the muck. So the Hudson cuts through 400-million-year-old sedimentary rock and metamorphic rock. 400 million years old. And so it erodes, and it's been eroding. The river's been grooved out by glaciers, but it delivers water to Manhattan and eventually to the Atlantic this color, okay? This is the color of Clear Lake, blue-green. Not so much muck. On certain seasons when there is sediment in the water, the Clear Lake water can look like that from the Hudson. It's very nostalgic for me. I usually have one tear. I'm capable of one tear. Oh yeah, it looks just like the Hudson. But so this is the color of Clear Lake. Why? Because of the plants, the cyanobacteria, which we'll call cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, and we'll also call them the nuisance algae. Okay, the nuisance algae. So they color the water. At other seasons and at other times, Clear Lake can take on a different color, and I'll talk about that later when I talk about the organisms. This is true green, and this is the color of a lake that is somewhere in the middle of being heavily subsidized and high nutrient content and being badly subsidized or unsubsidized. So this system, we would say middle-fed in Latin. We would say mesotrophic, okay? Mesotrophic, middle-fed. Okay? Our systems that we're talking about mostly today, these green water systems, we call eutrophic, or truly fed, or fully fed. So eutrophic and mesotrophic. And then if we get to a system like Lake Tahoe or the Central North Pacific, where I worked on my dissertation, there's hardly any plants in the water, so the water takes on its natural color, and that is blue. These systems we call oligotrophic, or few feeds, or fewly fed, or poorly fed. So eutrophic, mesotrophic, and oligotrophic. I'm belaboring this because it's on the test. This is on the test. So I give you a color, you spit some Latin back at me. You're gonna do all right. All right, so this is a lighter blue from shallower, pure water. And this was the color that introduced me to this whole system of why color change in water. Yes?
What about blue lakes?
Blue lakes. Blue lakes are two lakes. One is kind of oligotrophic, the one that's closer to Mendocino County. And then the one closer to our end is a mesotrophic lake. Okay? So here you have a county in which you have something called Clear Lake, which is not clear, and something called Blue Lake, which is not blue. So it works out. But one of them is kind of blue. And those lakes are there because that was the drainage for Clear Lake into the Russian River system before there was a giant landslide and mudslide that you climb over as soon as you get away from the Blue Lakes. So you hit the Blue Lakes on your left, and then there's this hill, and back up. That is a mudslide that changed the drainage from the Russian River to the Sacramento River.
So how big was Clear Lake before that? It must have been like
Clear Lake in its history has been bigger, smaller, and so it's about a moderately sized lake right now. You could see there would be a large area around Big Valley and some area in the Upper Lake Zone where the lake could have in past geological decades been big. The lake, cores in the lake suggest that it's about 1 million years old at least. So some people say 2 million, and I think that's a stretch. I think it's safe to say 1 million if I was going to bet on something. And I have a great deal of interest and confidence in people who bet now because of the Brexit thing, right? The polls were all wrong, but the bookies were. Yeah, the betting people were spot on.
London.
Yeah, okay.
London.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So anyway, here, this is the color story, and I wanted to check for questions before we change the page and perform a little bit about food chains. Yeah.
I just have one question. How does the amount of water compare to the two bodies of water?
All right, good question, and I promise to handle that more on the next
Oh, okay.
sheet. But right away, there's an immense amount of water because of the flow.
Right.
Okay, but when we measure the freshwater flow, it's 21,000 cubic feet per second. Okay, so 21,000 cubic feet per second. Clear Lake on a moderate rainy day. Once the soil is saturated in the watershed for Clear Lake is something like 800 square miles. Once that watershed is saturated and you have a moderate rainy day, you get 51,000 cubic feet of water per second. So the influx into Clear Lake is sizable compared to the freshwater inflow in the Hudson. Okay, so we do have those numbers.
So do you know the watershed for the Hudson?
Yeah, the watershed for the Hudson is something like 12,000 cubic square miles.
Wow.
Yeah, and make sure I got that number right. I can check it for you.
So do they get a lot less rain or what?
They get more consistent rain. So day after day after day, 365 days a year, every second, 21,000 cubic feet of water is exiting in some way or another. Yeah. So it's a system where consistent rain, consistent exit, whereas we have influx in the wintertime and then a stop. Yeah, very interesting. Very different systems. Yeah. Okay, so we wanted to introduce you and cement in your brains a little bit about food chains, so we're going to perform a song about food chains. Yes.
What body of water is represented with the light blue?
The light blue is a swimming pool in New Jersey that I filled in 1966 after painting it white. Okay, I paint this swimming pool white. That's my summer job. Yeah. The lady says, "Can you hang around and fill the pool?" And I said, "Sure." Okay, thinking it would take an hour. Okay. Swimming pool is 3,000 cubic feet of water. Okay, so that's 1/7 of the flow of the Hudson River, right? So, in a second. So I fill the pool, and lo and behold, it turns this color. And that's what got me hooked on this whole thing, painting pools. People say, why did you become an oceanographer? I was painting a swimming pool. Fascinated by the color change, it went from white to blue, and that was it. All right, so Rick McCann, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Let's sit up here. This is Billy Strayhorn's tune, Take the A Train. But we're gonna just change the words a little bit. This is Take the Food Chain. Let's hope it stays where it's supposed to. Oh, it's not. Okay, so. What do you think, Rick? Is that gonna do it?
You do the intro?
No, we're just gonna get right into it. Hey, take the food chain. Say, get shuttle carbon in a hurry. Each link in the food chain loses some oomph to heat and hexagonic entropy. Now consumers or producers photosynthesize, that's the producers, and the consumers chow down on them with hungry eyes. On the fixed carbon, and here's what I know about food chains. I know that energy flows and matter cycles, so what's your worry? Now green at the base of the food chain. Those plants are waiting there for you to exhale. Go ahead. You release oxidized carbon, which they convert to cellulose and sugar, holy mackerel, what a bargain. And besides that, you might want to kiss them, because if they died, you would surely miss them. That's for certain, because there'd be no playing. And that's what I'm saying. Without the oxygen that sucks your tired old hydrogen atoms in. Now you and I can notice two different types of food chains. One that has efficiency and accumulates tons of biomass. That's green water, eutrophic. The other is into diversity. That's the blue water, and at the university, it prompts questions that professors emeritus love to ask. Like, why do the most productive communities end up with the fewest species? The plankton paradox, and here's what I know about food chains. Each is a symphony where all the music ends in entropy. Now you and I, we could join a food chain. All we'd have to do is swim around where white sharks are roaming. We might splash and revel till the time came for us to join a higher trophic level. Now the shark, say his name is Marvin, he gets a tenth, maybe a tenth of our carbon. He can't have all of it, he leaves it just bite us, leaves us to try us. And though it is alarming, we are now part Marvin. And though it is alarming, we are now part of mobbing. Thank you, Rick. At any point in this ramble, if you need to use the facilities or get a cup of lemonade, you could do that. We're going to stop in a while and get a cup of lemonade. But if you needed one immediately or need a bathroom, go ahead. Let me see if I can do this without sailing away. Here is the shot of the mixing that goes on in these two systems. This is the lunar mixing from tides in the Hudson. It forms a giant saltwater tongue. I want you to envision being at my old home in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, looking west to Staten Island. Okay? My apologies to those of you who don't like Staten Island. And what you'd see in cross-section, if you could look underwater, is a tongue of salt water from the Atlantic coming in and sliding under this fairly small contribution of fresh water from the mountains upstream, 21,000 cubic feet per second. Big player is the ocean. Okay? Now this water is coming down. The fresh water is moving, but it's moving slowly. At a 150-mile trip from the federal dam at Troy, that spot, that dam, the water level at that dam is only 5 feet higher than my water level at the Narrows, under the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. So the head on this thing is not incredible. It's not at all like Cache Creek or any of the western rivers we're used to. Okay? So it's very mellow, and it gets pushed around by the ocean, and there's a great deal of mixing. Now that 21,000 cubic feet, the Hudson carries a signature of a lot of human influence. And we have influenced Clear Lake, and we're responsible for some of the eutrophication, not all of it. So one of the things I want to make sure that you leave here with is there's a problem in Clear Lake, but it's not entirely a human problem. It would be a eutrophic lake. We have evidence that it was a eutrophic lake long before people like you and I showed up. It's just that we added a critical extra amount of nutrients to make it a nuisance. Okay, remember that word nuisance is an important word in any discussion of this problem. But the Hudson is really impacted. Fully 7% of the fresh water in the Hudson River is effluent from sewage. And when I was a kid, it was not tertiary treated, not secondary treated, not primary treated. It was not treated at all. So 1/7 of the flow along that stretch of river where I lived was sewage, raw sewage. Okay, in those years, this is what I was talking about: fixed carbon. Fixed carbon is fixed carbon in terms of the ecosystem. The organisms don't care where that carbon is from. Okay, so they took advantage of that. An entirely different kind of ecosystem existed at the sewerage, and record sturgeon catches at that time. Okay, so the system will recycle whatever we give it. My uncle owned a fish market in Bay Ridge, and when he went there early, the fishermen from the Hudson River were still delivering the sturgeon, and there would be a sign on it: Hudson River sturgeon. As soon as the last Hudson River fisherman delivered his sturgeon, the fishmonger would take that sign out and put a new one on, the same fish, and it said, Long Island Sound sturgeon, because people knew about the Hudson, okay? And so the problem with the Hudson was well known. My mother wouldn't let us swim in the Narrows, but we swam anyway. What she didn't know, what your mother doesn't know, can't hurt you. And my mother didn't know about the PCBs. And so the PCBs were in the water from 1947 to 1974, which would include a lot of my swimming years. And so had she known about that, I don't imagine she would let us swim. But I'm glad she didn't know, because we had a lot of fun. And we retrieved a lot of lumber. So joined the economy that way. Let's get to Clear Lake. Clear Lake, solar powered, wind ripping out of the northwest, the same axis, as long axis as the lake. so to maximize mixing. And you get waves at Jago Bay, I mentioned that. But all along in here, you get something that's called Langmuir circulation. And this Langmuir circulation causes a vertical spiraling under the wind in an interaction with the waves. So a lot of this physics is fascinating in that at first you just have a sheet of water with wind blowing over it. As soon as you get waves, then the waves interact with the wind. So your new setup is achieved, and you get vertical spiraling motion at a distance of about 3 meters apart. So you're on the lake, or you're there near the lake. On a windy day, you see the striped lake. How many people have noticed the stripes in the lake? 1, 2, 3. The rest of you get to work. It's windy. Go down there, check out the lake. It's got stripes in the direction where the wind is blowing. And what that is, it's debris brought up in the sections where the water descends. So there'd be debris here called windrows. Those are windrows. And the organisms, this is good news and bad news for the organisms, because the depth of this circulation is about 5 meters. So in a 7-meter average depth lake, quite a bit of the lake is 5 meters or shallower. So that this type of circulation induced by the wind at the surface reaches down to the bottom in all those locations on the lake where it's 5 meters. And if you sail and you've got a keel, you know that quite a bit of Clear Lake is shallower than 5 meters, right? Gonna back me up on this? I owe you one. All right, so this is the mixing, vertical mixing. The organisms are taken from a zone where it's light down into the darkness. That's a negative for them. The phytoplankton are photosynthesizing, they're being carried down. But there's a positive, because in the trip, along with them being brought up from the bottom, are these nutrients that they require. So these are the mixing stories. One more story about the Hudson. Fully 50% of the fresh water in the Hudson, by the time it gets to the Narrows, has been run through a cooling tower in a power plant or in an industrial cooling facility. Fully half of that fresh water has already served. Okay? This gives us in Clear Lake an advantage. When we look at our lake, I'll call it our lake. When we look at our lake, we see a lake. We don't see a cooling facility. We don't see a means of navigation. We don't see a sewage disposal unit. We see a lake. And that is a big advantage to us. The first part of the environmental movement on the Hudson River, where Pete Seeger was involved, was to get people to love the Hudson, to get them to enjoy it, because it was for them a sewer, it was for them a cooling facility, and so on and so forth. But we have an advantage when I talk to you about Clear Lake. You're here because you want to use the lake, you want to recreate on the lake, you want to enjoy the lake, or you just want to look at it, which is sufficient. And it was very hard to get people to even look at the Hudson. Very bad reputation. So here's our lake mixing from the bottom.
I have a question.
From solar energy. Yes.
What speed does the wind have to be before that starts happening?
Oh,
How
I would.
long does it take to develop?
It's I'm trying to remember. I know in sailing terms, it's a force 3 wind, maybe 50 miles an hour, 15, 20 miles an hour.
12 knots creates white caps.
Okay, as soon as you get white caps, very soon after, even if the wind does not increase from the white caps, as soon as you get white caps, you get that. So 12 knots. Yeah. Okay. And I tell you what a knot is. This is 4 knots. If I walk 3 times as fast, that'll get. Now, how do I know 4 knots? Because when you tow for plankton, you do 4 knots. So you'll see me on the docks down in Red Bud Park. You see this strange middle-aged man walking like this, walking his dog who's drowning. No, that's the plankton. Yeah, somebody have a question.
Yeah, I was wondering what you said the individual spiral cells are about 3 meters.
Yeah, they're about
wide.
3 or 4 meters.
I was wondering, does that depend on how fast the wind is blowing?
I think it
or
does.
what,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but I know that in lakes
complicated
it's
stuff.
pretty uniform.
Is it?
But in the ocean, I don't remember it being all that different. So it may be more or less more or less a constant in that. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, so I'm going to do the flip here.
I have a question.
Yes.
The salt water going up the Hudson, how far does it go up underneath the fresh water, and when does it start being completely mixed?
It goes to the Tappan Zee Bridge, which is Hackensack. So it goes about, I'd say about 25 miles. You can tell you can tell that there's saltwater intrusion. Yeah, yeah. Well north of Manhattan. Yeah. Okay, so here are the organisms, and with a few modifications, the organisms from the Hudson, they don't look all that different from the ones in Clear Lake. I've drawn the Clear Lake ones because those are the ones I'm quite a bit more familiar with. And so I wanted to start in the middle of the food chain with the small animals. So obviously at the top of the food chain you've got the fish, which is of an interest to a lot of people, as it should be. And then at the bottom of the food chain you have the plants. And they are concerned for us because, as I said, some of them are a nuisance. So we'll start with these little animals, and this is on the range of a millimeter in size, these organisms. And the way to connect people with microorganisms or small organisms like this is to find some personal connection. So there's people among you who have been here for quite a while, maybe 30, 40 years. You have a very personal connection with this organism right here. This is Chaeoborus asticopus. Chaeoborus is the Clear Lake gnat. Okay? And your personal relationship with the gnat is that you breathed it, you ate it, you had it in your eyes and your ears and your throat. You can't get any more personal than that. And when in the 70s and the 60s, some parts of the 50s, these were amazingly thick in Clear Lake. It's hard for me to curb my enthusiasm about these organisms. They're a nuisance, but to me, it's just amazing. To a biologist, they're phenomenal. And that productivity of the lake was expressed in the standing stock of these little gnats. But they're not gnats, they're actually midges. And so we have two types of midges. There's Chaeoborus, which are tiny. They're the ones that come into your house through the screen, buzz around your lamps, get cooked, so you go into the room where they've entered and you smell bacon frying. It's not bacon, it's midges on your incandescent lamps. Right? So you have a personal relationship with this, and you have a political relationship with it, and a historical relationship. This organism was such a pest to the people here, such a nuisance, that they began to use insecticides to control it in late 50s and early 60s. Not DDT, but a relative of DDT called DDD, because they felt that it wouldn't harm the fish as badly as DDT. And so this made Clear Lake famous in one way because the process of what happened with the DDD was picked up by the most superb environmental writer in the history, and that is Rachel Carson. So Rachel Carson publishes this book in 1962 called Silent Spring. And on page 50, it says, the beginning paragraph on page 50 begins like this. Can we suppose that the poisons we introduce into natural environments will not enter the cycles that we find here? The answer to this question can be found in the amazing history of Clear Lake, California. Then for 5 pages, for 5 to 10 pages in the world's most important and famous ecology book, The Story of Clear Lake, and the biomagnification of the DDT in the food chain is outlined in superb manner. The first time I read this book, I was 62, I was 16 years old. Okay? And even that, just a kid in Brooklyn, and I said, man, this broad can write. And that kept that attitude about writers through all my teaching. I've made it important to my students. I said, nobody's going to listen to you unless you can write. And they said, wait a minute, listen, write? I said, you got to write. So I have people write. That's my way of telling you to expect essay questions. So there's an essay there about the history from Rachel. There's other small animals. This is a water flea, Daphnia. This is a copepod called Cyclops because it has how many eyes? One eye, so it's Cyclops. And this is a rotifer. Rotifers have very interesting sex lives. They only have sex in the autumn. And that's the only time the males are around. And then the rest of the time when I capture them throughout the rest of the year, it's all females, and they reproduce asexually. Right? So I always explain this to my students. These are the single mothers. All right. So these are important because they're what eats the lower end of the food chain, the plants, and they're what is eaten by the species that most people are interested in. Species that most people are interested in are the fish. What was shown in the research in DDT, which Rachel Carson wrote about, is that the higher up the food chain you go, the more concentrated these poisons are, like DDT, like PCBs, like methylmercury. Okay, so those are the poisons that I'm talking about, and they are highly concentrated by the top of the food chain, by the predators. So if you go to dinner with me, we're at a restaurant. We're going to have seafood. First of all, the waitress comes and says, "What would you like?" Immediately, I would say, if it was one of my students, as a waitress, I would say, "Fixed carbon. I'd like some fixed carbon, some organic matter, please. Don't try to serve me carbon dioxide. I have plenty of that." So fixed carbon. Then the second thing they'd say, "No, what do you want?" I said, "I want the youngest, lowest food chain fish you have." Okay. So if I was going to eat something from Clear Lake, I would eat the thread-fin shad. I would eat the thread-fin shad, knowing the data from the Hudson River, where Chaeobarus is also, that the shad, 65% of the shad's diet is Chaeobarus, is this midge. Right? So by eating the shad, I'm thanking them for eating all these midges, keeping them off my light fixtures, and I'm just going to eat those fish. This is threadfin shad right now. The lake is teeming with threadfin shad, which means it'll be a very good year for the grebes and other diving birds. How many birds can there be on Clear Lake? One day, the Clear Lake arm of Clear Lake was full of western grebes, western and Clark's grebes. Those are the big ones that do that dance. Lovely, lovely creatures. And I was sailing, and I said, "I'm going to do some science while I'm sailing." I put down my beer, and I started counting grebes. And I went on close to the wind, I went up, and I counted 200 before I ran out. Then I came about at about a right angle, and I counted 200 in the other dimension. If you multiply 200 times 200, you get 40,000. And they were thick. There was no holes in that giant square of grebes. 40,000 animals, and they were eating these. So we may have quite a few grebes this year.
Was that this year you were saying?
It was about 12 years ago. About 12 years ago. And I think we'll see that again.
Well, something I know, for the last 5 or 6 years, I haven't seen any baby grebes out in Canocti Bay.
Yeah.
But this year, there's a bunch of them. There's a
Yeah.
lot of them, right?
Yeah, and they're early, I think. I don't know for sure, but I think they're early. Yeah. They're teenagers, those little guys. They're doing great. So, so the fish, we want to eat a small, young, lower food chain fish and avoid these top predators. Now in the Hudson, this picture of what to eat is complicated by two things. One is the PCB is much more dangerous. I can't think of a better word. It's just much more dangerous. So the cautions on eating in the Hudson are more critical. But there are some species that you can eat because the Hudson has an andromous fish. It's an estuary, so there are species that come in to mate and then go back out into the ocean. So the shad in the Hudson and the striped bass in the Hudson, the bluefish and the sturgeon all behave like sailors. Come to New York, go to a bad neighborhood, have sex, and then get out of there and go back to sea. Okay? And so they're not spending a lot of time in the PCBs, and so those species are a little more safe. So, but nothing's anandromous in Clear Lake. maybe in the old days, maybe when it was connected to the Russian River, maybe when it was connected more continuous to the Sacramento River, it might have had some salmon. But so whatever we eat in Clear Lake has lived in Clear Lake and nowhere else. And so it's been accumulating these methylmercury. Now, one of the lessons from Clear Lake was how much fish to eat, how to measure toxins. The California Environmental Department did some of the first careful guesses about how much fish people could eat, and it was used by the people in the Hudson River and other polluted environments for determining guidelines. And the guidelines for Clear Lake are per week. And I'll give you a kind of quick and dirty review of these guidelines. The guidelines for the Hudson are per month. Okay, so right away you have a fourfold increase in danger with respect to these two types of pollutants. And I'm talking about methylmercury in Clear Lake and polychlorinated biphenyls in the Hudson River. And in Clear Lake, if you are a youngster, under 17, or a woman in childbearing years, you are not allowed to eat any largemouth bass. But you can have 3 servings a week of some other fish. And a serving is defined as your palm. If you've got a big palm, shout out. If you have a little palm, watch it. Okay? But you can do that. And I've done this in restaurants. You put your palm on the fish, decide how much you want. If you are not a youngster or a woman of childbearing years, a man or a woman of a certain age, you can have 1 bass per week or 3. So for the kids and for the women of childbearing age, 0 and 1 per week, and for the men and older women, 1 and 3. That's the rule. And then if you're in the Hudson, a safe measure is do that per month. How many people here actually eat fish from Clear Lake? All right, so I'm preaching to the non-choir.
We used to eat a lot of them from the lake,
Yeah,
but we're not fishing anymore.
yeah. I've
If
eaten all this
somebody would
stuff.
give them to me cleaned, I would be happy to eat
You
them.
would?
And
Okay, you're my hero. You're my hero because I don't get it. I don't get the taste of it. The stripers and the Hudson, yummy. Sturgeon, yummy. But these aren't too bad. Yeah.
Between the bass and the lower fish or the younger fish, where would the crappie?
The crappie would be right in here, a little better than the catfish because the catfish eat on the bottom, and the bottom and in the fat of the living organisms are where these fat-soluble pollutants are. So I would put the crappie in between the catfish as a bottom feeder and the threadfin shad as a very young, short-lived organism.
So maybe a couple a week.
Yeah, if a big strapping guy like you. Yeah, that's what would happen. Okay, we're gonna have another song. This one's about the Hudson, and we're going to, after that, or during that, whatever you want to do, there's lemonade, isn't there? And then bathroom break, and then I won't be very much longer. I don't think I can keep you here much longer than that. So we'll have maybe 15 minutes more after the break. So, Rick, have you got that all stabilized?
Blue skies?
No, the other one. Lazy River. This is Hoagie Carmichael. This is probably the worst way to get introduced to Billy Strayhorn and Hoagie Carmichael. But, you know, it's important when I'm doing these songs for young people, you know, they need to know about these cats. So they know about Hoagie, and that's on the test too. This is, the Hudson is a lazy river, right? So here comes the ocean tidal forces pushing it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It's really quite amazing. All right, we're all set. Here we go. Ba 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 boom. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Well, I like lazy weather lazy days. I can't afford to lose my lazy ways. Henry Hudson's River swings beside my door, a salty from the Jersey shore. Up a lazy river in a brown green plume, a back and forth twice daily, pulled on by the moon. I throw a rubber ducky watching right up the stream. She'll be back down later, ask her where you been. Up a lazy river not too long ago. Fat cats in Manhattan pooped into the flow, but biota fancy free enjoyed this subsidy, 'cause up a lazy river fixed carbon is fixed carbon. Up a lazy river with me. Now up a lazy river, if you've got a hook and a line, you can catch more fish than you should eat every time. And above the dam at Troy, you better catch and release. Maybe keep your pan empty and just eat the grease. Oh, the lazy river where the EPA 6 years into dredging says, oh, it looks okay. So you can dive into the plume, the plankton will make room. Up a lazy river, don't you mind the PCBs. Up a lazy river with G. See if I can get in trouble. It might seem unfair, no yummy taste of stripers on the bill of fare. My attorney Bernie, though he's so old and so gray, throws down his menu, sues the APA. Noah and the Wildlife Service, they might just come along, and they can provide data suggesting something's wrong. Yes, the river can turn around, but Bernie holds his ground. 'Cause up a lazy river, Pete Seeger can sing to earn his fee. I'll tell you, up a lazy river, nothing's free. Made it through the fish and zooplankton, which are the animals. Now I'm going to talk about the phytoplankton, the plants, and these are the nuisance algae over here, or they're actually bacteria, cyanobacteria, and these are an assemblage of non-nuisance algae. And years ago, Karen Mackey described these as the good algae and the bad algae, and I hadn't never really thought about that as a biologist. I never really assigned morality to different species. So it was a real shock to me that there was such a thing as bad algae. And so we bad polar bears and God knows what else. But so anyway, these are the algae we see in the spring, and they persist through the summer, but they become quite a bit less important as it gets warmer. And as it gets warmer, then these problem forms, these cyanobacteria, they flourish. There's the golden brown algae, the green algae, the red algae over here on this side. And it's interesting to look at this stuff. Not as many species as you would see in the open ocean or in Lake Tahoe. So Lake Tahoe, if I wanted a sample from Lake Tahoe, I would take this net and I would go tow it for a good part of an hour to get a reasonable sample. But in Clear Lake, I could get a reasonable sample in 5 minutes, sometimes 5 seconds. But about 5 minutes would be a standard tow. But when I did that in Lake Tahoe, I would find many, many more species than I do in Lake County. This was the plankton paradox that I mentioned in the song. And no one has really figured out why it is that when you have a lot of energy going through the system, it's divided among fewer types of plants and animals, at least for the plankton. Once you get up to the fish, and that rule is broken, and the birds, it's certainly broken. Hardly any place as diverse as Clear Lake for birds. Yeah.
Is Lake Tahoe, is that typical of the Sierra lakes up in the high country?
It is in terms of its color, and in terms of the abundance, and in terms of the rate of photosynthesis. It is kind of typical. It's becoming atypical as there's more human influence, as there's more erosion into the system. It starts to look different than other alpine lakes, for sure. So they have bumper stickers that say "Keep Tahoe Blue," okay, and so I've avoided having a bumper sticker saying "Keep Clear Lake Blue." Really weird. Now they're gone. But at any rate, each of these organisms has a personality, and it's a joy to sample and see what's there. The springtime, this early spring and also late fall, the lake this fall took on a brownish Hudson River color, and I thought it was a breakdown of pigments from the cyanobacteria. I thought they were dying slowly and that they were releasing this brown pigment, and that's what I told everybody on the phone. Then I got a call from Rick. Rick McCann called me up and he said, "I've got this sludgy stuff in the filter from the water treatment plant at the Young Scandinavian Club."
The final filter before they drink it or put it in an ice machine.
Yeah, and so he brings this thing over. I said, "Chief, thanks a lot. Only I would be delighted with a canister of dripping, sloppy sludge." And it was the color of the lake, and I thought, well, that doesn't make sense. If I'm right and this pigment from decaying cyanobacteria is being released, it wouldn't be in the material itself. So I put it under the scope, and it was this. This is a species called Nitstia. And you see how small it is? It was going right through my net. So it was so tiny that I wasn't sampling it. And so my grandfather always said, "To a man who only has a hammer, the world looks like a nail." Okay? And so I was assuming that there was hardly any plankton in the lake, and that this brown color was loose as a dissolved organic material, but in fact it was this. This species, its brother, its cousin species, was in the news that same fall. While Nitstia was making Clear Lake brown, Pseudonitstia, very, very closely related species, I can't tell them apart, but one's in salt water, was making the Dungeness crab inedible. So all autumn we could not have Dungeness crabs. In fact, most of the winter, I think, we couldn't get any Dungeness crab from this section of the coast. That species in the ocean produces domoic acid, which is a neurotoxin, and so it was wisely, the crabs were wisely outlawed, but broke my Christmas heart anyway. But essentially those two organisms were in the news. So in the spring, when it starts to warm up, these organisms, what Karen Mackey would call the good algae, start to decline, and then the bad algae come on. And these aren't algae at all in the botanical way of speaking. They are bacteria, photosynthetic bacteria, and they're very, very important in the economy of the lake. They're the major producers, and they are historically important, since this is a living history day. These are the organisms that, in an evolutionary sense, invented photosynthesis with the release of oxygen. So they're responsible for our current atmosphere. So long before higher forms, like historians and oceanographers, could evolve, what you needed was a highly oxygenic, a highly powerful oxidizing agent in the atmosphere, and that's the oxygen that we breathe, and it allows us to use our food very efficiently. Well, these organisms invented the release of it 2 billion years ago. So they're the ones that fix most of the carbon. And if you're a gardener, I should mention that these forms also fix nitrogen. So they do what the bacteria in the roots of legumes can do. So you plant a garden and you have peas and beans. Those will develop, if you're lucky and the conditions are right, little nodules where nitrogen is pulled out of the atmosphere and made into a form that plants can use for making protein. And these organisms can do that on their own. This becomes important later when we talk about the management of this problem, because we don't really pay attention to nitrogen when we try to control the growth of these organisms in the lake. They can get their own from the atmosphere, so the nitrogen budget doesn't interest us that much. What interests the ethnologists and oceanographers in managing lakes with this type of overnutrition problem is phosphorus, because these forms are good competitors for phosphorus, and these problem forms are not. They don't compete very well for phosphorus. So that is the scheme of management where we put the lake on a phosphorus diet. How? By creating wetlands, by developing wetlands where there were wetlands historically. There were 7,500 acres of wetlands around Clear Lake at the time of the first Europeans came. 85% of that has been lost. If we do this Middle Creek Restoration Project, here comes the advertisement for this. If we do this Middle Creek Restoration Project, we can almost double the amount of existing wetlands. And wetlands are magic because they tie up nutrients and they stop sediment. So the sediment, 90% of the phosphorus that gets into the lake comes in sediment. Only 10% is in the water itself. So if you have a wetland, it's not going to last forever, but it will last our lifetimes for sure. You have a trap for the sediment so that it doesn't make it into the lake, doesn't become ammunition to be mixed in by the kind of solar-powered wind mixing that I was talking about. So the phosphorus, these forms will still manage to compete for what phosphorus is there, and these should slow down in their growth. Yes.
Could you explain competing for phosphorus and what does phosphorus do?
What phosphorus does is it's like cellular money. So in your cells, you break down food, but the food is a long-range source of energy for you. The food is converted to a very unstable, energy-rich compound called ATP, and that has phosphorus in it. Also, your DNA, which is the nucleic acid, which is your genetic material, that has phosphorus. So the energy to run a cell and the genetics to pass that information on to the next generation, living cells require a lot of phosphorus. And these forms, when they capture the phosphorus, they have a way of taking more than they need and storing it, and these forms can't do that. As marvelous as they are, okay, they haven't developed that trick. So the phosphorus is important, and it serves the same function in gardening. So if I go to the nursery and I'll say I'm looking for a high phosphorus plant food, and the lady at the nursery, she knows how to get my goat. She'll say, oh, this will develop the roots and stems marvelously. And I get all angry and I say, it has nothing to do with the roots and stems. Every stinking cell in the plant needs that for ATP and for the enzymes that make proteins, and then she just gets excited that she's got my goat. It's great. So phosphorus, all living cells need phosphorus, and we would like to put the lake on a phosphorus diet. It's difficult because it's an action that requires long-term commitment to improving the edges of the lake. It's difficult because it's not an action. We're not doing something, we're stopping doing something. So it's a very feminine kind of approach. Men like to do things. Me, I love to do things, even if they're wrong. Saturday morning, I'm ready to do something. If it's wrong, I don't care. Meanwhile, my wife is lying in bed next to me. We're waking up. She says to me, I'm wondering what I won't do today. And so when you manage the lake, you have to think like my wife. You say, I know how we can improve the lake. We can stop releasing so much phosphorus, especially with respect to the sediment. The sediment is important in the politics of pollution as well. There's two types of pollution. The first we've handled pretty good with the Clean Water Act in 1972. This is called point source pollution. It's the kind of pollution that we witness in the Sulphur Bank mine, where we can point to a company, where we can point to an outfall, where we can point to a smokestack. That's point source pollution. You can find who's responsible, and you can assign blame. It's very satisfying if you're that kind of person. Okay? If you're a person who likes to assign blame, study point source pollution. The non-point source pollution is what we're tackling now in the 21st century, and that is diffuse. It involves material from the sky, from cars, from fields, from farms, and it's very hard to keep track of. And if we had to point to who's responsible for non-point pollution, we'd have to point to ourselves. And so we'd say, oh, I drive a car. I use a golf course. I ride on the road that has to be cut through. And I have to absolutely cut fire breaks. All of this adds to sedimentation, habitat destruction, and overnutrition. Those are the three things that are harder to deal with. And so these are the 21st century ecologists, my students. I emphasize that type of non-point pollution. A lot of the lessons from the Hudson River involve nailing point source polluters, General Electric, Capital Battery Company, the New York Central Railroad, the City of New York sewer system. This is what was attacked, and that was the great success. And everybody who knew about ecosystems sat back and said, I wonder what they'll do when they get done with the easy stuff. And so that's what we're handling now, is the non-point source. So these forms, right now in the lake, here's a form like Anabina. So if I take the microscope out, I'll see these little green string of pearls. This is Lingbia. You have a personal relationship with this from 2009, 2010, and 2011, when the lake was piled high with absolute cakes of this stuff. That's Lingbia. It looks like a pile of poker chips in a cellulose sheath. This is Microcystis. It's a concern because it produces more toxin in general than the other species do, and we're worried about that. So far, we've only lost one individual in Clear Lake. A dog died from ingesting Microcystis on its fur, and also another dog in the Russian River drainage system died. And so my lesson to everybody is don't lick yourself dry. Go swimming in the Clear Lake, but don't lick yourself dry. And that's what those dogs do. So we want to control them, and the idea is to control the phosphorus, a diet. Okay, put the lake on a diet. Here are the pollutants that I've been talking about. This is polychlorinated biphenyl. This is methyl mercury. In both cases, both at Fort Edward in the Upper Hudson and in the Sulphur Bank mine, it turns out that the exact same amount of material has been removed and moved and removed. 2 million cubic meters. In the case of Clear Lake, 2 million cubic meters of mine tailings from a 150-year-old sulfur and mercury mine. And in the Hudson, 2 million cubic meters of river sediment and channel sediment from a 40-mile stretch of the river. This cost close to $70 million already. And there's 3 lovely articles in the paper. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday's Record B each had an article on what's going on in the Sulphur Bank mine. Pretty good articles on that to get you up to date on that. A lesson from the Hudson is to not let the Environmental Protection Agency leave. They're like bad lovers. They say, oh, that was good for me, I'm going now. Okay. We need to say, hang on. And the Hudson is not done. There's still a lot of PCBs in the sediments. And so quite a few entities in New York are are suing the EPA about finishing. They're pulling up their tents and they're leaving. So I was happy to read in his articles that the EPA made no mention of terminating its projects here. They're not making a lot of headway because the funding's not there, but they're not terminating either. So it's good news and bad news. Another thing that's worthy of its own talk is the zebra and quagga mussels. These are organisms that don't like salt. So my stretch of the Hudson, from the Narrows, where I only swim occasionally, to West Point, where I swim a whole lot, is free of the mussels because it's salty, it's brackish. If you get about 60 miles further up, about the first 60 miles of Hudson, no mussels, but from then on, they're a problem, and they suck everything out of the water column, and they reduce the productivity. So in the natural freshwater portion of the Hudson River, still tidal, still sloshing back and forth, but not much salt in it above Newburgh or West Point, you have 330 grams of carbon fixed every square meter per year. That gets reduced because of the mussels sucking down the primary producers to 80. So you get about a quarter of the productivity. It's very deceiving, and I need to warn you about this. Should the mussels arrive, the lake will be clear for a number of years, and people will love the mussels. They will love them. They'll scrape them off their outboard motors. They'll hike their sailboats up out of the water. They'll scrape their water pipes because the lake looks great. But what's happening is that the algae eventually compensate for the filtration by the amazing amount of nutrients that the mussels leave in an available form on the bottom. So the mussels filter material, but they don't digest all of it. Some fraction of what they filter, they jettison, and it's called pseudofeces. And those pseudofeces are phenomenal piles of available phosphorus for the system. So in Lake Erie, the first 4 years, everybody was happy with the mussels, and then they had the cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae, nuisance algae, return with a vengeance. And there were pictures from Lake Erie 2 years ago and 3 years ago where they had huge cakes of Lingbia like we did, and I had Lingbia envy. I said, wow, look at their cakes. Their cakes of dead algae are bigger than our cakes of dead algae. Amazing. And so be careful about the mussels. Too much of a clear thing. I said in the description of the talk that many people felt that the condition of the Hudson has improved. It has, because point source pollution has been controlled. And I said that many people aren't sure that the conditions in Clear Lake have improved. If we look at Secchi depths, we can see that the lake has become clearer in the last few years. And it is also a mixed blessing. There are statistically significant higher Secchi depths all throughout the year in the last 15 years. But the price we pay for that initial clarity is that we have a bottom weed problem in the upper portion of the lake. So remember that the average depth of the lake was about 7 meters. Slightly shallower than that, the lake is capable of supporting bottom plants. And that's what's plaguing Lakeport, and that's what's plaguing the upper lake, the shallow end of the lake. And it's doing that because of the clarity of the water. Suddenly there's sunlight on the bottom where it hadn't been for many, many years. And so these plants are starting to grow. This year we have a little less clarity, and it's ironic, but it's something that I am celebrating for the benefit of the people in Lakeport. They might not have such a bad year with the bottom plants because the clarity of the lake it's not as clear as it was the previous years. So you get into these binds. So dramatic changes. I just want to wrap this up. I've kept you long enough.
Yeah.
So I wanted to say what's on the exam so you're ready. I always do this. I always tell people what's on the exam. Give them a form, right? And I'm going to ask you about the difference between subsidized systems like Clear Lake and the Hudson River. I would ask you about unsubsidized systems like the Central North Pacific. These, of course, are green systems, and these are blue. I'm going to link the colors to the Secchi depth If a body of water is blue, you know you're going to have a very deep second depth. Central North Pacific, where I worked, 30 meters, a third of a football field. You could lower that disc and it would look like a little white dot, but you could still see it. The clearest water in the world in the middle of the ocean. No plants. Then we have winners and losers because of I was thinking of the mussels. There are some parts of the community in lakes and rivers that do very well with the mussels. The plants do very well because of the clarity. The bottom plants do very well for a few years. And the animals that like the bottom plants do very well. Long-term and short-term toxins. The toxins that we were talking about, methylmercury and PCBs, those are long-term toxins because cells see them as fat soluble. They're fat soluble, so they get stored like cholesterol in the fat deposits inside cells. Biomagnification, that's the lesson from Clear Lake that was so well written by Rachel Carson. The difference between point source and non-point source pollution, I think I covered that well enough. Deep and shallow pockets, the absence of deep pockets in Clear Lake. A good example is the Bradley mine. The people who released all of the mercury in the tailings, that is a company called the Bradley Mining Company. It's no longer in business. There is a trust set up by the family of the Bradleys, but they have no money. Now Hudson had an advantage. General Electric is still a very, very profitable corporation. They have been forced to pay $500 million in the cleanup of the Hudson River. And that's barely enough to get started on the work. So if there's a screw up, you hope with all your might that who screwed up has some money. Okay? It's like someone smashes into my rear end on the highway. I look in the mirror and I say, I hope the hell it's a Mercedes-Benz. Okay, and that's what ecologists think the same way. Deep pockets and shallow pockets. The shallowest pockets are you and I, the public, and I'm very proud of the population in Lake County. The Measure S, the majority of people voted for a tax, a sales tax, to support the health of a natural ecosystem. When I tell my friends back east about that, they can't believe it. This is one of the poorest counties in the United States, and the people voted, a majority of people, not 2/3, that's what was needed, but a majority of the people voted to tax themselves for a lake. Unbelievable. Hooray for you. Okay, then the Hudson Trinity, where those fat cats with the mansions, the robber barons, they got involved, the Sierra Club, zealot celebrities, and shrewd lawyers from Manhattan. One of the things that we don't have 50 miles from here is a center of angry young lawyers, okay? Because that's what was required. And well, we'll find enough. We have to find laws that are being broken, and there are some. Clean Water Act guarantees you high quality water. And the idea is to use that plus the public trust to tackle in some way non-point source pollution. As I told you, it's a problem because the culprits are us. And when we break the law, it's a very huge collective group of defendants, everybody. A model from Sylvia McLaughlin, she died a few months ago, and she was behind Save the Bay. She had an idea how to mobilize large numbers of people in the Bay Area around a problem. And I'm retired, and I can see her as my model, my hero. I want to become a Lovet. And what a Lovet is a little old lady in tennis shoes. And this is an actual term in modern ecology and environmental science. The Lovets are loose and active and important. I'm going to pester you. In the next 2 years, I will pester all of you in support of that Middle Creek Marsh project. When it gets to a point where pestering our representatives, of sending people to Washington, I'm going to look for someone who is eloquent and well-dressed and say, how would you like to go to Washington? Okay. So we're going to look for that, and the other thing that's important is the A-Dweem. I am one. I'm an A-Dweem who wants to be a Lovet. This stands for Almost Dead white European male. Well-stated white European male. Where the Lyons can supply push, the Adweens supply pull. You find people in power and talk to them even if they are old men. We don't care. You're powerful, we need to talk to you. Either here or at Sacramento or wherever we can encounter you. Push and pull. And so my exam is simply to hope that I covered what I mentioned I'd cover. One more song. Hopefully I can keep you for the song. And then if you care to ask questions, you can stay. If you need to go, you certainly can go. I applaud your patience. I've kept you here for over an hour and a half. And my students would never stand for that. They need me.
Did
All right.
you sing in your classes?
Oh, yeah. Oh.
Very good.
I can't understand what
Okay, so here's another, this is another introduction for my students to Irving, Berlin. This is Blue Skies. Now we're gonna do that, we'll do that twice and then in we go.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah. Did I bring the kazoo? I owe you a kazoo solo. Imagine being owed a kazoo solo. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da, ba-da-ba-ba. Blue lakes are blue as the sea, for the same reason, almost chlorophyll free. Oh, Green Lakes, as per your hunch, are loaded with pigment. Fish can find lunch. Now the greener the water, the thicker the plants, the nutrients and sun, production and chance. Energy's transformed and life piles thick. You can say it now in French, it's eutrophique. Blue Lake, cut to the quick. It's a low energy desert. You can say it, oligotrophic. Whoa, Blue Lakes like Lake Tahoe, new and so clear, are found in mountains colder than beer. Usable energy almost without, but the few fish there are delicious trout. Now each lake is a lady who changes with time, mellows and warms, almost like wine. You can monitor her changes by noting her hue, deny her nutrients, and she will stay blue. But then nitrogen, it arrives on the scene. That's when your blue lake starts to turn green. Phosphorus, keep it scarce, that's the trick to keeping an emerald mesotrophic. Now phosphorus and nitrogen and iron and such enliven but people. We add too much unending biomass. What do you think? We show it by wind, rots and must stink. Blue-green, a nuisance algae, bad, piled on thick. It's all overnourished, eutrophique, say it in French. Ciel bleu, qui me surveille. Je ne vois que
le ciel bleu, des oiseaux bleus chantent une chanson, la même chanson toute la journée. Je n'ai jamais vu le soleil briller autant. Je n'ai jamais vu les choses aller aussi bien. Je vois le jeu passer si vite. Quand vous êtes amoureuse, qu'est-ce qui passe vite? Je peux envoler rien que le ciel bleu et manquer. It's those blue greens piled on thick. It's all overnourished. It's eutrophic. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, sir.
Oh, great.
The man could be sailing.
Thank you.
You all could be sailing, but instead you're here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.